or overlaps between political theory and political ideology, let us start with this definition or understanding of political theory, which deals with the three aspects of politics or political, that is explanatory, normative as well as the contemplative. So, political theory must explain something, and that explanation should be relevant to a particular specific context, and this explanation then must not also be limited to that particular context or the historical time and space. It must also transcend that context and have a degree of generality, that means that allow the political theory to not just explain politics in a particular society, but also to provide resources and approach to explain political society in other societies. So, that is why we can make a distinction, say when we study Indian politics or American politics or European politics, the focus is on a particular society or a country or a community, and its scope is limited to that country. But when we study political theory, there we do engage with a particular real pragmatical context, but also we must transcend to have a degree of generality or application in explaining, analyzing or studying politics in other societies. So, one of the feature of political theory is it must be explanatory. The second is the normative part of political theory, where the theory is supposed to be not just merely explanatory or descriptive in nature, but also have a normative concern to provide the alternative, to provide the resources or mechanism to transform the existing reality or existing practices in any society. And third and finally, which is a contemplative exercise. This is inherent in any political action, political discourse or political argumentation, and especially so in political theory, that it must have a contemplative or reflective part on it while engaging with a practical social and political problem. So, political theory in that sense deals with this explanatory, normative and contemplative aspect of politics, and this explanatory, normative or contemplative exercise in political theory is grounded in reason and rational argumentation. So, the progression of theory is through logic, through reason and rationality, unlike political ideology, which we will come to in a moment. So, it provides a set of concepts, methods and approaches to systematically study and analyze politics. That is the task of political theory, to provide concepts, methods and approaches to study politics in politics systematically and also scientifically. In doing so, it tries to engage with the real and pragmatic. These questions which we have discussed in the previous class, that there have been criticism of political theory as a discipline which deals with abstract concepts or normative questions which has no or very little significance in the real practical world, and how political theory have evolved from that kind of contemplative or merely speculative exercise to make it more relevant in terms of engaging practical and real life world, we have discussed in the previous class. But important thing that we need to remember is, while doing so, it tries to engage with real and pragmatic, but not limited to these. That means when it explains the real or the practical world, it is not limited to that reality or that practical issue. It must transcend that real or practical situation to have a degree of generality, a general application in explaining or studying politics in other societies, and that distinguishes political theory from say Indian politics or Western politics or American politics and so on. Due to its normative nature, it also provided the resources for not just making sense of or understanding politics, but also transform it. So, it has a transformative potentiality as well, and it does so in a very different way than a political ideology does, where it actually tries to mobilize the masses, to guide them, to convince them for a particular course of action to capture the state, to transform the society and so on. On the other hand, political theory also provide the potential to not just make sense of the existing reality or existing politics in society, but also to transform it. But it does so in a more discursive manner to understand the complex or the layered nature of the politics and the political situations, and by knowing that, one can also then act upon those understanding or study. So, it also and that comes with the normative concerns or nature of political theory. Now, if we compare political theory with political ideology, we find that political ideology on the other hand has acquired a negative connotation and seen as fixed, doctrinaire and closed worldviews, with its emphasis on political actions and capturing state power. What defines political ideology is its focus or emphasis on acquiring political power or mobilizing the masses or leading a movement which aims to capture the state power and through that transform the society and polity in any society. So, political ideology is a worldview, is a guide to action in a sense to transform the society and politics in other. In doing so, it has a very negative meaning, and you often come across in our public political discourse that politicians usually accuse their opponent in projecting them as ideologically driven, but they consider themselves as driven by the public interest and without being guided by any kind of ideology and so on. So, political ideology generally speaking, and we will discuss it in details in a moment, but political theory and in comparison to political theory, political ideology is seen as a kind of fixed or a closed worldviews which focuses on a course of action and to capture the state power to transform the state and society. So, this understanding of political ideology as a closed worldview or a fixed a doctrinaire system of beliefs is one aspect of political ideology. There is another aspect of political ideology which is more positive, that is that no matter how much we criticize the ideology of others, in criticism, in criticizing that ideology, we are also guided or shaped by political ideology. So, in other words, there is no escape from ideology. So, whether we oppose someone or on the basis on which we oppose someone is already always ideologically driven. So, the positive side of ideology is then not merely as a kind of closed worldview, which is true to some extent, but there is another positive aspect of political ideology as well, which allow us to criticize, to capture, to transform the social realities. So, then the political ideology is something which is already always there to shape our beliefs, opinions and political actions. So, our political beliefs, actions and outlooks are always shaped by ideologies. Now, ideologies are not intrinsically rational, and that is different from political theory. Here political ideologues use reason, use rationality and logic, as long as that using of reason, logic and rationality helps them achieve certain practical purposes or practical end results. So, their relationship with reason or rationality is a more strategic in comparison to political theory, where the argumentation must proceed through a logic, through rationality. Political ideology uses reason or rationality, but as long as it helps it to achieve its practical ends or desired results. Now, political theory deals with concepts which are essentially contested concepts that we have discussed, that all the concepts that we discuss in political theory, be it equality, liberty, justice, democracy, rights and so on, are essentially contested. That means there is no one singular common consensual understanding or definition of these terms. Now, these essentially contested nature of political theory is a result of these ideological interpretations. So, in the political discourse, where there is a multiplious presence of different ideologies, tend to interpret these terms differently, and that leads to the this contested nature of the political theory. And in that way, political theory is also deeply connected with political ideology. So, there cannot be a kind of clear cut separation of political theory from political ideology. So, you have within political theory different traditions, Marxist tradition, liberal tradition, socialist tradition, feminist tradition and so on. So, political theory and political ideology in that sense also overlaps and are deeply interconnected. Now, if we discuss what is political ideology, let us begin with this Michael Friedan definition, or in a sense of description of ideology, where he writes that ideologies are usefully comprehended not as defective philosophies, or as we have been discussing, merely as a negative connotation or negative understanding of political ideology. So, ideologies are usefully comprehended not as defective philosophies, but rather as ubiquitous and pattern forms of thinking about politics. So, what characterizes political ideology? Is its ubiquitous and pattern forms of thinking about politics. They are clusters of ideas, beliefs, opinions, values and attitudes usually held by identifiable groups that provide directives, even plans of action for public policy making in an endeavor to uphold, justify, change or criticize the social and political arrangements of a state or other political community. So, the defining feature of political ideology is its ubiquitous nature and a pattern forms of thinking about politics. And these ubiquitous and pattern forms of thinking and the groups who carries this pattern forms of thinking are identifiable. So, in the public political discourse, you can identify, associates the individual and groups with different forms of ideologies. And these clusters of ideas, beliefs, opinions, values and attitudes together constitute a worldview and provide a direction or even a plan of action to formulate policies in an endeavor to do all these things, to uphold the existing status quo, to justify it or to change it or criticize the existing social structure in any state and society. So, the ideology plays a very significant role in the political development in any societies or transformation in any society, which is a set of beliefs, set of ideas which has a pattern of thinking among the identifiable groups of people who tries to either justify or change or uphold the existing structure of politics in any state and society. So, that is the significant understanding of ideology. However, we need to remind ourselves that when ideology was coined, it did not have the same connotation or same understanding. So, we can trace the origin of political ideology to the origin of a state. So, the political actions or the ideas which propel political actions is as old as perhaps the state or any forms of collective thinking. So, one can trace the origin of political ideology in the origin of a state. However, the term ideology was first coined by Antoine de Tracy after the French Revolution, and his objective was to study political ideas which will help transform or emancipate or empower society systematically or scientifically without any prejudices and free itself from the metaphysical contemplative thinking. So, the origin of ideology was to study the political ideas systematically or scientifically, and therefore, ideology was supposed to be a science of ideas and not ideologically driven by different political groups or parties. Political ideology, as term suggests, is about studying any ideas, political ideas scientifically, systematically, and it is therefore a science of ideas. However, the term ideology soon acquired a negative and pejorative meaning, and in the political arena, as I have discussed, you may often come across political groups or leaders or followers accusing the other of ideologically driven and themselves as guided by public interest and not by any political ideology. So, it is in popular perception seen in a negative sense as a closed worldview, as a fixed doctrinaire kind of worldview which distorts or which has very little or no significance to the real practical political world. So, it is seen as a set of beliefs guided by idealism. So, idealism you can also see it as a kind of utopia. So, all political movement or political ideology have a particular end or a kind of utopia or objectives to achieve by transforming this existing social and political realities. So, it is political ideology is seen as a set of beliefs guided by idealism which has very little or no significance to reality as it exists. In fact, according to Marx, one of the political scientists, it conceals the actual material interests of the bourgeoisie. So, ideology he defines as a kind of false consciousness. It more than a kind of action or a kind of political action for empowerment or emancipation, ideology actually distorts or conceals the actual interests of the propertied groups or those who are better off. So, in German ideology he argued that political ideology is false consciousness which conceals the actual oppressions or injustices of masses and also conceal the material interests of the bourgeoisie. However, in turn Marxism itself developed as an ideology which aspired to create an egalitarian and classless society. So, more on this we will discuss later. So, no matter what the claims are, all political actions and movements are guided by political ideology of one kind or the other. So, any political criticism or political action or movement are always shaped or guided or inspired by a particular form of ideology. Sometimes there may be simultaneous presence of many ideology, or within a ideology different varieties of interpretation of that ideology, as we will see when we will discuss liberalism, but all the political actions and movements must be guided by a particular or particular forms of political ideology. Now, for us to identify a political ideology is to look for a suffix like ism. So, we have all kind of ism, starting from say liberalism to conservatism, Marxism, socialism, feminism, post-structuralism, environmentalism or ecologism or Gandhism and so on are all ideology. It has these all have particular ways of looking at the world. They want to reconstruct or restructure the world in a particular way and assign the role or particular role to particular groups and individual according to their description or their expectation of that society or that individual and groups. So, taken negatively, we usually associate ideology with dogmas, authoritarian and doctrinaire worldview that distorts the reality and therefore is considered as a threat to free, tolerant and democratic society. So, usually overall understanding or interpretation of ideology, despite of its promises of the glorious future or to reconstruct or transform the society and to bring about glory and empowerment and so on, is considered as a dogmas or authoritarian doctrinaire worldview, which is a threat to the free, tolerant and democratic society. So, that is one negative connotation of political ideology. Now, positively, if we look at the positive aspect of ideology, that political actions require certain inspiring values, norms or set of beliefs, then political ideology also provide those beliefs, values and norms. So, in that sense, positively, if it is taken, all ideology cannot be equally true, no matter how promising to common people, such as fascism, Nazism or fundamentalism of all kind. These are also the ideology which promises a better future, and in promising that better future, they requires loyalty, they requires follower. So, their actions are future oriented, and in the process of achieving that future or bringing about that future, they requires loyalty or followers, and this kind of utopian aspect of political ideology is present in all the ideology. But does that mean all the ideologies are equally true or equally valid, and we should all have a neutral judgment about all forms of ideology, that everything is correct, everything is relative. So, no one particular ideology have a monopoly of truth. Now, on the one hand, if we think of ideology merely as a dogmas or authoritarian doctrinaire belief systems, then it is a very negative connotation, and yet we cannot escape the influence of political ideology. On the other hand, if we take political ideology as a positive thing and therefore all forms of political ideologies are correct, then equally it is problematic that we cannot justify ideologies like fascism and Nazism or fundamentalism or fundamentalist ideologies of various kind, which is genuinely a threat to a number of communities within or outside that society or a state, and it has brought about, as in the case of Nazism, we have seen in 20th century lots of horror or catastrophe to the society. So, can we justify all forms of ideology because of it is also having some positive aspect of it? Now, to understand this paradox, Karl Mannheim wrote a book called Ideology and Utopia, which is considered as a modern classic. Explore this question, that can we discuss ideology without being ideologically ourselves? So, can we have a critique or a study of political ideology without ourselves being ideologically driven? Now his answer is to look for a political class or what he calls intellectuals who can study these ideologies in somewhat objective manner, and his answer was this: locating the social position. So any ideology and opposition to that ideology has certain positions, and there to judge a particular ideology becomes a problematic. Even when you criticize the other, your own positions are also based on certain assumptions, certain ideology or certain perspectives. Now how to overcome that and study political ideology? Carl Mannheim provide an answer where he is looking for locating the social positions of intellectuals who can relatively distance themselves from the social classes, to examine or study the merits or demerits of any ideology. To study the political ideology, we need a distancing from the social classes, various social classes, and then perhaps our understanding can be more convincing, more persuasive. However, it is not always true that intellectuals who can relatively distance themselves from social classes is supposed to study political ideology objectively. It has not been the case always. So we also find the intellectuals justifying the horrors of Nazism and fascism and many other kinds of fundamentalism. Now how to tackle these paradoxes of the negative and the positive sides of political ideology? And therefore what is required is to study the ideology in both its aspect, that is negative and positive. On the one hand it is problematic and distorting, on the other it is also inescapable. So there is no escape from ideology. So although there have been this debate like end of ideology or triumphant of capitalism or liberalism, yet we have seen the constant elasticity, revival and reassertion of this ideology that makes the politics a dynamic, complex and conflictual arena. So we need to study political ideology in its both negative and positive aspect, as there is no escape from political ideology. Now then to have a kind of more systematic, scientific or rational understanding of ideology or a political movement or political action requires the tools and approaches of political theory. Now if we discuss very briefly some of the major political ideologies of modern times or also the contemporary era, first and the most dominant political ideology is liberalism, and we will also discuss the critiques of liberalism. So in modern politics and society, if you study any institution of governance or politics or parliamentary form of democracy and so on, is rooted in the beliefs and values of liberalism, and therefore it is the most dominant political ideology of modern times or even in our contemporary times. However, it also has many rivals or critique, and Marxism is perhaps one of the most fierce critique of liberalism that we will discuss. So let us first discuss this liberalism, which has many internal varieties. So there is no one singular conception of or set of beliefs about liberalism. It has evolved from its classical to the modern to a more contemporary version of liberalism to some other alternative political ideologies such as communitarianism, multiculturalism and so on, which also evolved from political liberalism, but also criticize some of the core beliefs and principles of liberalism. So liberalism has many internal varieties, and it is truly an elastic political ideology. In a sense, it tends to absorb its critique to make it relevant and more inclusive. So, liberalism has evolved over a period of time, but absorbing the critical aspect of many of its critique. So, from the exclusive emphasis on individual to a more egalitarian or welfare oriented politics and political ideology, liberalism has evolved and absorbed its critique within its fold, and that makes it a truly elastic and also dominant political ideology. So, there cannot be and there is not one singular set of beliefs which we assign to liberalism. It had acquired many distinct and at times often contradictory principles, norms and values. So, we can discuss it with this example of John Rawls and his 3 books called Theory of Justice, Political Liberalism and Laws of People. Now, these 3 books of John Rawls, which started with a kind of universalistic approach in liberalism. That means universalism is not, liberalism is not confined to any particular history or particular social context. It has application in all kind of society. So, we think about modern democracy, parliamentary form of democracy or rule of law or constitution, and its neutrality and objectivity gives it a kind of universal application. Now, John Rawls started with then developing a theory of justice which will be universal, in a sense that to arrive at a theory of justice which can have universal application, and if it is implemented correctly, then expectation was the end result will be the just. So, he started with this liberal premise of arriving at a theory of justice which will be universal in nature. Now, with the critique, he developed in political liberalism the pluralistic or more pluralistic approach to the theory of justice or different conception of political theories, or what he calls the primary goods and the idea of primary goods and so on. So, different ideology, different groups can still come together to have a kind of common consensus. Further on the laws of people, he went one step ahead to include even those who are visibly seems contradictory to each other, respecting their laws and still maintaining some kind of common minimum obligation to each other and maintaining the harmony and peace in society. So, in Rawls we have seen a progression from more classical liberal premise to a more contemporary premise where he acknowledge or take into account the different orientation, different approaches to politics among different societies within the large state and polity. However, liberalism basically focuses on individual as a rational agent who knows what is best for him or her, and therefore it desires that state and polity should give that individual maximum opportunity and freedom to explore what is good or best in his or her interest. So, it also argued that the material worth or the actual worth of the individual can be based, or a thing can be based just by a free market economy. There should not be any regulation or control over the economy or exchange of trade. So, liberalism has this premise of individual as a rational agent knows what is best in his interest and should have maximum freedom and opportunity to explore that. And secondly, the best judge of worth of an individual or a thing is the free market. The role of a state and society in this understanding is then minimal. only to reconcile and regulate the individual interests through an objective or neutral laws and constitution. So, in the liberal philosophy, liberal approach, the constitution and laws are expected to be neutral and objective. So, this is one of the most dominating philosophy of political ideology in modern world, and John Locke, Adam Smith, Thomas Paine, Hayek, Nozick, Milton Friedman and many others are proponent of this ideology, and it has many inner varieties. So, that we will discuss in a moment. That is, however, liberalism has many critiques from within and without. So, within there are communitarians or multiculturalists like Taylor, Michael Sandel or Will Kymlicka, and instead of liberalism's focus on abstract isolated individual who is rational, these theorists, multiculturalist or communitarian theorists, are arguing about socially and culturally embedded individual and group differentiated rights. So, in liberalism, the individual is considered as rational. So, therefore, certain rights are fundamental for this individual, and these rights are given to the individual because of him or her being the human being, the individual, and not because he or she belongs to a particular caste, particular group, particular community and so on. In contrast to that, multiculturalism or communitarian thinkers believe that individuals do not live or exist in an isolated society. He or she is part of a large network of groups and communities, and therefore is an embedded individual, and therefore he or she should be given certain rights, which is by taking into account the background of that individual. So, the minorities in different liberal democracy with its majoritarian tendency and so on requires the state to recognize the background of the individual and accordingly provide him or her rights, which is different from the universal rights as is there in the liberal philosophy. So, within liberalism you have then philosophy or ideology like multiculturalism or communitarianism, which believes in this socially and culturally embedded individual and group differentiated rights. Now, from without or externally, liberalism faces greatest challenge or criticism from Marxism, where instead of individual as in liberalism, Marxism emphasis is on class as a basic unit for social political philosophy. Now, we will discuss this philosophy of Marxism in a moment, but here we need to understand that liberalism continue to be a very relevant political ideology in our contemporary times. However, it faces many challenges. It has also provided the condition for the emergence of different ideologies, say for instance liberal feminism or social democrat or liberal democrats or liberal egalitarianism and so on. So, liberalism in that sense remains a kind of elastic political ideology and includes different variants of political thoughts and thinking within its own domain. So, social democrats, feminists and environmental activists are equally critical of liberalism. However, liberalism remains a dominant political ideology and it has proved to be elastic enough to absorb the critics within its fold, as is clear from the example of John Rawls that we have discussed earlier. So, it absorbs its critique to make itself more accommodative, more flexible and hence more relevance, and it continues to change or acquire new characteristic according to the changing nature of political discourse and political development. So, from the classical liberalism to modern to contemporary, and then again this new right or so on, you have seen the constant elasticity of political ideology in liberalism. Now, Marxism is one of the most contested political ideology in the modern world, which is revered by the half of the world and devoured by the another. So, half of the world admire or appreciate and take Marxism as a ray of hope from their existing oppressions and injustices. On the other hand, the other half of the world see Marxism as the biggest challenge, or communism, which is emerged out of Marxist writings or worldviews, is seen as the biggest threat to the existing social and political world. So, and it has caused many revolutions such as Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution, or in Vietnam or in Cuba. There are many political movements still in many parts of the world guided by or inspired by the ideology of Marxism. And you see the political contestations in different societies following the liberal strands or the Marxist strands of political thought. So, Marxism is one such contested political ideology, and for a very long time it had divided the world into two warring camps. If you remember the history of Cold War, the division of world into two groups between US led by USA on the one hand or USSR on the other hand, guided by this opposite political ideology of liberalism, capitalism or free market on the one hand, and communism and classless stateless society as a utopia on the other hand. So, it claims to speak on behalf of dispossessed working classes. So, one of the legitimacy for Marxism is on the basis of its explanation of the inequalities, especially social and economic inequalities that is widely prevailing in a capitalist liberal society. So, it considers liberalism and capitalism as bourgeois ideology, whereas they regard themselves or their own theories as scientific and aspire to emancipate the world from their present oppressive conditions of existence by creating a classless and stateless society, and that is how it replaces, it claims to provide alternative to the liberal ideology. So, the basis of this ideology was the writings of Karl Marx, Engels, Lenin, Gramsci and others. Like liberalism, it has its own internal varieties. So, from the writings of Karl Marx and Engels to Lenin and further on to Gramsci, you see a evolution in Marxist political ideology as well as it is there in liberalism. So, the new left or post-Marxist and so on is the progression of thought and set of beliefs in Marxism itself, and it remains relevance in a new liberal era, where every time there is a slowdown in economy, there is the resurgence in the interest in Marxism and Marxist writing. Socialism as an ideology emerged as a sharp critique to liberalism and capitalism, and it criticizes capitalism for the socio-economic inequalities which has led to alienation and has reduced the working masses merely as a labor force deprived of any suitable human condition. So, socialism aims to emancipate human beings from socio-economic inequalities by avoiding the extremes of both Marxism and communism on the one hand and liberalism and capitalism on the other hand. So, it tries to reconcile or it tries to bridge the extremes of both liberalism and Marxism to provide a better alternative for the emancipation of the masses. So, it criticizes the institution of private property and focuses on the collective ownership or the community ownership of the resources. So, one of the early socialists like Pierre-Joseph Proudhon declared property as nothing but theft. Charles Fourier was another early socialist who criticized capitalism and drew attention to reorganizing the production and distribution systems that prevails under capitalism. The major proponents of these ideologies are social democrats. In India also, if you remember the post-independent movement, socialism was a very dynamic or promising political ideology immediately after the independence, certainly in the first and second decades. So, if you recall Jai Prakash Narayan, Acharya Narendra Dev or Ram Manohar Lohia, they were all the leaders of socialist party, and they wanted to avoid the extremes of both the hollow promises of liberal ideology on the one hand, which provides political legal equality, but do nothing about the actual social and economic inequalities. And on the other hand, it also avoided the extremes towards left, which tries to radically alter or rupture the existing status quo to bring about revolution, to bring about radical change in the existing social reality. So, it tries to avoid the extremes for bringing about the emancipation or to removing the social and economic inequalities in society. The feminism is another political ideology which emerged as a critique to liberal conception of individual and politics. So, in liberalism, individual is a rational agent, and therefore, there is no gender sensitivity in liberal philosophy, because it claims of neutrality and objectivity. That means it is gender blind, and the political arena or state and its institutions are considered then open for both the genders. But in the actual practices, in the actual functioning of politics, we have seen how women had to struggle for getting recognition as the equal member of the society with equal rights and opportunities and so on. So, as basic a right as right to vote, for that women have to fought a long and hard battle. So, therefore, feminism is very critical of this liberal conception of individual and politics, and they criticize its male oriented individualistic conception of state and politics. So, the discourse or the language is dominated by a male oriented approach to both politics and state, and it also divides the life then into a private personal life and public, and it deals more with the public sphere. So, in the liberal philosophy, say religion is considered as the matter of private life, and state deals with the matters related to public life. Now, feminists are very critical of this gender neutrality of public sphere and also the state, and they declare that the personal is also political, and like liberalism or Marxism, feminism is also a very diverse body of thought, and we have many tradition of feminists like liberal feminism, Marxist feminism, radical feminism, black feminism, Asian feminism and so on. So, they are united in terms of fighting for the oppressed conditions or existence of the half of the humanity, but they also have a variety of approaches and methods to interrogate, to interpret and to participate in the public political life. So, feminism and its attack particularly on patriarchy and its emphasis on the gender discourse have radically altered the major premises of social and political life in the contemporary world. And in comparison to liberalism and Marxism or socialism, Feminism is of recent origin. Say in 1960s it started with the claim of personal is political, and in 1970s, 80s and 90s it has acquired more radical turn. And now with this focus on patriarchy, you see how it alters the major assumptions in our social and political life, in our public institutions and so on, and how it is making the public or a political discourse sensitive to the gender requirements of particular groups, be it women or men, or also the LGBT community, that is lesbian, bisexual, gay and transgender and so on. So, recognizing their rights, recognizing their needs, being sensitive to their requirements and so on, are constantly altering the major premises of our political life. Now, nationalism is one another such ideology which is also considered as an ideology, but it is very different from say political ideologies like liberalism and Marxism or socialism or even feminism. So, you can be a nationalist, but then being nationalist you are also open to be a liberal or a Marxist or a feminist and so on. However, nationalism tends to provide a kind of emotionally and psychologically a group of people or a large masses and bring them together to form a community and to give them an identity which transcends the other identities that is based on ascriptive identities such as caste, gender, class and so on. So, it emotionally and psychologically binds a mass of people together, and its members form a community which claims to share a common history, culture, tradition and language. And we have seen how 19th and 20th century there have been different waves of nationalism and how it altered the geography of the world into different nation states, and how nationalism is a powerful psychological and political tool for social and political movements in different countries. And we are familiar with the anti-colonial struggle in India and also in other Asian and African countries in its latest third wave of nationalism. So, it started in Europe, and then the second wave was in Latin America, but the most recent and the third wave was from the anti-colonial movements in Asia and Africa, and there is also again the positive and negative side of it. So, it is also seen as emancipatory or liberatory for many people, but also it is seen as divisive or exclusionary, where the loyalty of the people or group of the people is confined to a geographical territory and do not extend to the large humanity and so on. However, it is a very powerful political ideology in modern times which aspire to form a particular community, particular nation of one's own, and to which one is then psychologically and emotionally connected. So, this term nation states refers to a group of people who claims to have a common past and are willing to strive together for a common future. Now, very briefly, this new ideology like post-structuralism, which has again radically altered the major premises in political theory. However, it is often seen as a critique of meta-narratives and itself being very less constructive in terms of providing or suggesting an alternative to the alternative course of action that it critiques. However, the post-structuralists such as Foucault, Derrida and many others have also developed an alternative model of politics and ethics. Now, in this alternative model of politics and ethics, they reject any foundational or grand meta-narratives of theory or ideology. So, it is a move away from the teleological worldview that believes that there is one starting point or end points and there are various stages in between. So, the time is a kind of linear time. So, that kind of teleological or linearity in the political ideology or the premises or assumptions of political ideologies are rejected by the post-structuralist thinkers and theorists, and it claims to more kind of relativism or identifying the structure of oppression and injustice rather than having a grand meta narratives or utopia about the future, as it is there in the many other ideology. So, it is a move from away from the teleological worldviews and grand theories, which often result in immeasurable cruelties and oppressions that we have seen in the case of fascism, Nazism, or many fundamentalist ideologies in the world, which promises a better future with a grand narrative, but in the process it unleashes violence, it indulges in cruelties or oppressions, and which is rejected by the post-structuralist thinkers. And in contrast to that kind of grand meta narratives, it tries to examine and identify the structures of injustices and oppressions to enable any emancipatory politics possible. So, it does not provide emancipatory politics or blueprint for emancipatory politics in a sense of grand narratives or grand theory, but it tries to explore the structures of injustices and oppressions and how to examine and identify them to make any kind of emancipatory politics possible. So, then it cut across the different ideological divides of earlier times and tries to work in a very small mundane way to create a more emancipatory society and so on. Now, finally, ecologism and environmentalism, it is a contemporary ideology which started in 1960s, and it is also a shift from the excessive focus on the human to the non-human, to include environmental concerns or climate change concerns in the domain of political theory. And we have a separate topic on the environmental ethics and so on, which we will discuss. So, as an ideology, ecologism is a contemporary ideology, and it focuses on the desires of the ecologists to protect the ecology, biosphere or nature as a whole. Unlike the environmentalists, who are basically concerned about the environmental and its consequences on human beings and their lives, ecological is not a typical human centric or anthropocentric approach like environmentalism. Rather, ecologism is ecocentric, and it strongly asserts that nature has an intrinsic value that human needs to realize and preserve. So, Leopold and Ness pointed out that all humans are dependent on ecology and biosphere. So, in this ideology, the shift is away from excessive focus on human or anthropocentric approach to politics or society to include the concerns of ecology, and ecology in its totality and not in its relationship with human or vice versa as it is there in environmentalism. So, this is also a kind of new and recent development in political theory. So, ecologists further believes that industrialization is the major factor for the degradation of ecology or nature, and it focuses on a sustainable society by emphasizing on limited consumption of natural resources, and we are all increasingly are victims of this excessive consumption of natural resources for our industrial purposes or developmental purposes. So, ecologism on the in contrast to that kind of consumptions argues for minimal consumption of natural resources. So, whereas environmentalism and environmentalists focuses on the uniqueness of human beings as living rational beings in the post enlightenment phase, and it places human beings outside and above the nature. So, the ecologism is in contrast to that kind of approach which focuses on human or keeps human being as a rational individuals in the center of all its philosophy. So, the major themes that we are going to discuss in this course is liberty, equality, rights, justice, power, state and sovereignty, democracy, citizenship, politics and environmental ethics. So, these are some of the key themes that we will discuss in this course, and there are multiple interpretations or conceptualization of these terms, and many of these terms are also interrelated, such as liberty, equality and rights, liberty, equality and justice and so on, that we will discuss when we will take up this issue in the next classes. Now, finally, this new developments or directions in political theory, if we see that politics is an ever changing phenomena, so is political theory, which tries to systematically study and analyze it. So, in terms of methods, concepts and approaches, political theory derives excessively from the Western tradition of political thought and philosophy. But there is a shift now to engage with non-Western traditions of political thinking as well, and to develop a dialogue with them to make political theory truly a global discipline. So, this is a new direction in political theory, which where it tries to engage with non-Western political thought and philosophy to make political theory a more global discipline. The concerns of political theory are also accommodative of new changes and developments. So, humans are no longer the only exclusive concerns for political theories. They now have to increasingly take into account non-human factors such as animal rights, climate change, environment and so on. So, as we have discussed in the new political ideology like ecologism and so on, there is the concern for the new concerns for the political theories. And second, developments in science and technology such as genetics can potentially alter the major premises of equality in political theory. Similarly, there is no singular and definite answer to questions of democracy, liberty and justice, and it needs to be explained contextually and historically, which political theorists tries to do. So, it is true that political theory overlaps with political philosophy, ideology and thought. However, a degree of generality, normative concerns, question of state and political power, individual and community remains some of the major concerns of political theory. Unlike political ideology, it does not aspire to capture the state power, but it does allow the resources and discursive terrain to not only make sense of the political, but also to transform it. So, political theory is not helpful in a sense of making sense or understanding the political society, but also it provides the resources or judgments and discursive terrain to transform it. So, this ability to not just explain or understand, but also to transform makes political theory a very fascinating discipline of study, and I hope when we will we study and discuss different concepts and terms, we will become more and more familiar with the different layers of political debates and discourse in any society, including Indian society, and also to develop a judgment which is very different from a kind of opinionated or opinion about any political and social issue which is contentious by nature. So, political theory as a discipline enable us to make sense of the complexities, the multi-layered conceptions or conflictual terrain of politics, and to have one's own judgment about it. And I hope when we will conclude this course, you will develop some of those skills methods and approaches to do that. So, on this lecture you can refer to some of these books like Rajiv Bhargav and Ashok Acharya, Political Theory and Introduction, and Andrew Dobson or Robin Eckersley, Political Theory and the Ecological Challenge. And again this book, the Oxford Handbook of Political Theory, is a very helpful book to understand many concepts and also some of the themes that we have discussed